Hello, my name is Zain Al-Qazi. I'm a labor and economic historian. Welcome to the fifth session of the Economic Histories of the Global South seminar series. This series, which has been running from the beginning of the year, brings together social scientists engaged in economic history from different parts of the globe to build a comparative understanding of the historical development of the Global South. Earlier sessions have looked at the political worlds of South Asian sailors, the long history of the Punjab peasantry, the lives of Mozambican workers, and the historical impact of labor-saving machinery on Indian labor. You can watch all of these sessions on YouTube by searching for our channel, the New Political Economy Initiative. So today we discuss Ahmad Shokr's new book, Harvests of Liberation, Cotton, Capitalism, and the End of Empire in Egypt, which was published by Stanford University Press this year. Our discussants are Jairus Banaji and Sven Beckert. But before we get into the session, a quick note regarding the format. Due to unavoidable circumstances, Sven will only be with us for the first half hour of the session. So we will start with Sven's introductory comments to the book, after which we'll have 40 minutes for Ahmad to speak about the arguments of the book. 20 minutes after that for Jairus to respond to them. And then we'll have a general discussion with the audience. So as an audience member, you can register your question at any time during today's seminar. Just use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So let me begin by introducing Sven Beckert. Sven Beckert is Laird Bell Professor of History at Harvard University. He researches and teaches the history of the United States in the 19th century, with a particular emphasis on the history of capitalism, including its economic, social, political, and transnational dimensions. In 2015, he published Empire of Cotton, A Global History, the first global history of the 19th century's most important commodity. His other publications have focused on the 19th century bourgeoisie, on labor, on democracy, on global history, and on the connections between slavery and capitalism. His new book, Capitalism, A Global History, will be published by Penguin next month. So Sven, over to you. Can take 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah, thank you so much for this kind introduction. And I am terribly sorry that I'm messing up the order of things here, but I'm sitting at an airport waiting to board the plane. And unfortunately, that doesn't allow me to be online later. So I will just give you some sense of Ahmad's book, and will talk a little bit about the many things that I really, really liked about the book. And then I will make some critical comments as well, but take them with a grain of salt, because I think they are really rather marginal. And my big takeaway point here is that this is a truly wonderful book. It is an important book that I think speaks to a whole range of literatures. Obviously, on Egyptian history, it does speak to the history of cotton in the 20th century. And it also importantly speaks to the history of global capitalism. Let me just start by saying that yeah, I think the book is so, for somebody who's not an expert in Egyptian history like myself, it reads very fresh, and it does give important new insights into Egyptian history and the role of cotton within it. So much so that when I read this book, I truly thought, oh, I wish I would have had this book when I wrote Empire of Cotton, because Empire of Cotton would have been smarter on Egyptian history in the 20th century if I would have had the privilege of knowing of Ahmad's research. So that is one of the spontaneous reactions that I had to reading the book. And the second one is, what I should say is that I'm no expert in Egyptian history. I know something about cotton in Egypt, but beyond that, my knowledge of Egyptian history is pretty limited. And thus, I cannot possibly speak with any kind of expertise to some of the claims that Ahmad makes about Egyptian history as such. So what do I think does make this book so important? For one, as many of you know, the history of cotton has been pretty extensively researched just think about all that literature that now exists about the, let's say 17th and 18th century cotton industry in South Asia. Think about the very extensive historiography on the history of cotton industrialization in Europe and the United States and Japan in the 19th century. And think about the very extensive literature on plantation agriculture in the United States and the question of what the importance of slavery is to the history of cotton. So we have a very rich literature on all of these issues, but we have really not fully researched the history of cotton in the 20th century. My own book, which is a kind of global history of cotton throughout the past 300 or 400 years, only spends the last chapter on the 20th century, and it kind of rapidly moves through that 20th century. So I think, generally speaking, the 20th century is a kind of unexplored part of the global history of cotton. And here we have, not only do we have an intervention into telling us about the history of cotton in 20th century Egypt, but we do have a kind of a model of how we can take that story of cotton further into the 20th century. And Ahmed, among many other things, shows that, lo and behold, cotton still matters a great deal to many parts of the world in the 20th century as well. So it's not just in 18th and 19th century history, but it's also a story that is very importantly about the 20th century. He does so by delivering what I think is a very convincing account of the nitty-gritty details of the changing economic structures of the cotton industry in Egypt in the course of the 20th century, but especially focusing on the years between, let's say, 1910 and the 1950s. He does that by quite systematically looking at a variety of actors within this industry. He starts out by looking at rural cultivators. He looks at landowners. He looks at the people who were organizing the transport of cotton, the railroads. He looks at merchants, and he looks at the bankers who financed land purchases and the trade in cotton. So the way how he describes and then analyzes the history of Egyptian cotton in the 20th century is by getting at the full diversity of actors who structured this industry. And I think that allows him to do two things. For one, very basically, it shows the complexity of this industry, and it shows the great diversity of the actors within it. But then it also allows him to do a kind of fine-grained analysis of how each of these actors and their specific roles in the cotton industry in Egypt changes in the course of the 20th century, which is, of course, crucial to the larger argument that Ahmad makes, namely about the shifting emphasis and the origins of economic nationalism among anti-colonial intellectuals and politicians in Egypt in the 20th century. So I think that is fantastically well done. I love the word, the global plantation. I think I've not encountered that before, but this was really a wonderful way of putting to giving kind of a framing to the entire story. And what I liked is also that you provide a kind of bottom-up view of that global plantation in its specific articulations in Egypt, and then you embed it within Egypt's political economy and within the global political economy of cotton. So that is all fantastically done. What I also like is that your work is very sensitive to the diversity of land, labor, and credit regimes in cotton and how they change over time. I think it would have been very easy to kind of write a history of that cotton complex in Egypt in the 20th century and just kind of focus on the most important articulations of that cotton complex. But you're always very sensitive to how things can be quite different and then also how they quite substantially shift over time. Then on a bigger canvas, I think what this book does and help us think about is it decenters the history of capitalism. I mean, this is maybe a very basic insight here, but I think it is an important one because so much of the history of capitalism still focuses almost exclusively on the continent of Europe and maybe the United States and a few other parts of the world. But here you insist on writing the history, inviting Egypt into the global history of capitalism. But at the same time, Egypt doesn't just appear as a kind of appendix of a European-centric story, but it does appear as a kind of world-shaping force in its own right. And it also you analyze a kind of articulation of capitalism in Egypt that of course is quite different from that of Europe, and you insist on making that part of the story of capitalism important to the larger global history of capitalism. So I think this is fantastic. I think, you know, there's still so much we don't know about capitalism outside Europe and the United States, and this is, to me, both substantially but also methodologically an important contribution to thinking about capitalism on a much broader canvas. Then you also do an important contribution to the history of capitalism by decentering the history of capitalism by focusing on the countryside. I mean, almost all of what you do takes place in the countryside. The only people who are like somewhere not in the countryside are some of the political activists and intellectuals and the merchants of Alexandria. But you do insist, like others have done before you, but I think very productively you insist on the importance of the countryside to thinking about global capitalism. And then my second to last point is that you do a wonderful job, I think, to root the history of ideas about political economy and ideas about economic life more broadly. You root them always in a particular political economy. So they're not like free-floating ideas that somehow, you know, smart people came up with, and for what unknown reasons they changed their minds on these things. But there's always a tight link between the moment in which these ideas emerge and the specific content of the ideas, and you do link the ideas, the specificities of these ideas often to the particularities of the global cotton economy at a particular moment in time and the Egyptian political economy at a particular moment in time. And this allows you, I think, brilliantly to trace the kind of changes in the political ideology of economic nationalism among decolonial activists and intellectuals in Egypt over the course of the 20th century. So this is also wonderful. And last but not least, the last positive thing I'm going to say here, even though there could be much more could be said, is that I think the book also does a wonderful job in bridging the kind of colonial and post-colonial history and the moment of decolonialization. I think there is not enough done on this. Often the kind of moment of decolonialization is almost as like if his history starts again from scratch thereafter, which is clearly not the case. And there are great continuities, but also, of course, great breaks between the colonial and post-colonial moment. So this book does a wonderful job in bridging the the colonial moment, the weird kind of semi-colonial moment, and then the post-colonial moment in Egyptian history. So this is all, I think, wonderful. So my critique, I think, is not so much about the specifics of what you do, but you know, as a reader, of course, you always have the sense, oh, there would be so much more that I would like to find out about, and maybe somebody else should write this book, and maybe, you know, I should read that other book, and maybe some of it already exists. But I'm just putting this up, putting this on the table for something that we can then discuss later. So for one, I thought that your discussions on post-colonial, on the ideas of post-colonial economic development, on the economic nationalism of post-colonial intellectuals and politicians is fantastic. But what I found missing was the global context for this conversation. Because, of course, these people are you know, embedded partly biographically because they spend time in London, Paris, and Berlin, and elsewhere. But also as you know, as the kind of things that they read and encounter and the people they talk to, they live in a world in which these ideas float around the globe, and where people in the Caribbean and India and elsewhere grapple with very similar ideas and come up with also ideas about how to shape a possible post-colonial political economy. And that I just found that missing. I mean, sometimes you allude to that. I think there are like a few mentionings of India, but I would have liked to see much more what kind of networks these people were part of, and what kinds of things they read, and what kinds of conversations they participated. That went beyond the country of Egypt. Then the second, you do a great job developing to kind of deliver a fine-grained picture of peasants and railroad owners and merchants and bankers. But what remains a little amorphous, I think, is still the state. The state appears, certain actors within the state are very, richly analyzed and described, but I was, the state was obviously extremely important to this history, especially the shifting during the Great Depression, which, by the way, is also a wonderful part of the book, this chapter on the Great Depression and its impact on the political economy. But the state plays a really important role in the shifting of the institutional embeddedness of cotton in Egypt. And I couldn't really grasp the state. It was, it was there, but it was, I think, under the analysis of the state, I found somewhat to be under analyzed. It's especially its kind of basic structures. I mean, maybe that would be too basic for somebody who studies Egyptian history, but for somebody who doesn't study Egyptian history, I found that to be lacking. And then one argument I was grappling with, and this is, you make a very big argument about how, nationalism, anti-colonialism, and ideas about political economy shift quite radically between the 1920s and the 1940s. And that was an attractive argument, and I found much of it quite convincing. But I wasn't quite sure if I was totally in agreement that you draw this kind of categorical difference between the world of economic nationalism of the 1920s and the world of economic nationalism of the 1940s. Because I think, yes, you show that the emphasis at these two moments is distinct and different. So that is good. But there was also a lot in common between these two moments. There was, this, especially the basic idea that it was necessary to capture state power in order to channel domestic economic development. You mentioned that at the various points in time, which I totally agree with. That's really important. But I think this pushes a little bit against your idea of a kind of categorical shift between the 1920s and 1940s. And in some ways, this became clearest to me when you talk about the beginnings of Egyptian industrialization. You really underplay the creation of the spinning company in 1927. This actually comes only 2 years after the ginning and trading company goes public. And once you describe that, you say, okay, we have here a program of industry without industrialization. But we actually do have the spinning company. And if you look around the world, of course, industrialization anywhere in the world, may it be in England or the United States or in India or elsewhere, started with the mechanization of spinning and weaving. And that seems to have been the case in Egypt as well. So I was a little uncertain if really this argument that there is what do you say, industry without industrialization really holds. I mean, I see the point that you're making about the importance of the countryside and the desire of economic nationalists to restructure the political economy of the countryside as their main focus. I do understand that, but it does seem to have gone hand in hand from the very beginning, also with the desire to embark upon industrialization, and of course within limits under the conditions of Egypt. And lastly, my last suggestion, I guess, is that I loved your emphasis on rural cultivators. I loved your emphasis on landowners. But what I found, I would have liked to learn more about them. I would have liked you to take the reader a little closer to these rural cultivators, to the cotton growers. And I would have liked you to take the reader a little closer into the into the homes, into the networks, into the activities of the landowners themselves. I don't know if this is possible. I don't know if the source base is rich enough to be able to do this, but I think that would have given me it would have given me more of a sense of actually understanding the dynamics of these places and also the dynamics between landowners and rural cultivators and so on. So this is my last critical comment. But just to summarize, I think this is a truly important intervention that helps us understand 20th century cotton, global capitalism, and the ideas and the politics that fueled the global struggle against colonialism. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sven. Let's move on. So let me introduce Ahmad Shokr. Ahmad Shokr is Associate Professor of History at Swarthmore College. He's the author of Harvest of Liberation. He is also a contributor to several volumes on the politics, history, and political economy of the Middle East. His research interests include the history of capitalism, imperialism, and decolonization. So, Ahmad, over to you. You have about 40 minutes.
Thank you, Zain, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Sven, for this. Your wonderful comments that certainly give me a lot to think about, and I look forward to engaging at least with some of them after Jairus gives his comments as well. Thank you to both Jairus and Sven for generously agreeing to comment on my book, and thank you to the members of the audience for taking the time to be here. It's really an honor and a privilege to be with you. So in the next 40 minutes or so, I'll lay out the main themes and arguments of the book. I'll explain how I arrived at this project, and I'll try to situate the book within some wider historiographies, of capitalism, both in Egypt and beyond. But first, I'd like to begin with an anecdote that might help capture the central or one of the central arguments of the book. So in 1951, the Egyptian communist Muhammad Galal published a treatise on the popular struggle against British colonialism in Egypt. Galal was a member of the recently founded Communist Party of Egypt, known by the name of its newspaper, Ar-Raya, and he wrote the treatise 1 year before a group of revolutionary officers would depose the Egyptian monarchy and eliminate the last vestiges of British control and fashion the country into a post-colonial republic. Now, in his treatise, Galal candidly distilled the reasons behind Egypt's colonial underdevelopment. The policy of colonialism, he wrote, has worked to cottonize Egypt, and this policy was adopted by Egyptian feudalists, end quote. Now, over the next 2 decades, his diagnosis became the foundation of a worldview shared by Egypt's post-colonial rulers under President Gamal Abdel Nasser. But Galal's account of the principal threat that British colonialism had introduced into Egypt differed from the way an earlier generation of nationalists would have described it. In the 1920s, Egyptian nationalists saw the prevalence of cotton farming in their country as a kind of gateway rather than an obstacle to genuine independence. So, for example, the Egyptian business tycoon and industrialist Talat Harb, who's the subject of numerous studies about decolonization in Egypt and who Sven Beckert referenced as one of the founders of this spinning and weaving enterprise in 1927. Well, in his writings, Talat Harb considered cotton to be what he called the hub of national wealth. And along with other nationalists, he tended to positively affirm Egypt's status as an agricultural country. Now, the difference between these two statements, by Galal and Harb, illustrates an important transformation in the consciousness of Egyptian nationalists during the age of decolonization. Like many societies, Egypt specialized in the production of raw materials, especially high-quality cotton. Until the post-war period, cotton was the most valuable raw commodity in world trade. Egypt was the third largest cotton producer in the world after the United States and India. It had a monocrop economy where cotton made up 70 to 80% of its exports. And its ruling classes consisted of a powerful landed oligarchy that produced cotton and a mercantile bourgeoisie, including many foreigners, that financed and traded cotton. So over 3 or 4 decades, cotton went from being celebrated by Egyptian nationalists as the basis of the country's riches to being condemned as evidence of a retrograde economic condition. Now, to explain why this happened and what it tells us about the quest for national independence, my book follows transformations in both the political economy and political meaning of Egyptian cotton during the age of decolonization. Now, let me say a few words about what drew me to this project. I had long been interested in global decolonization and the ways in which it succeeded or not, especially in the Middle East. I've also been interested in histories of capitalism in the global South and how they complicate Eurocentric theories and conceptions that are derived from the Western historical experience. And the event that encouraged me to study the relationship between national sovereignty and capitalism was the Egyptian Revolution of 2011. Among other things, it was precipitated by decades of free market policies promoted by Western powers and financial institutions that resulted in a massive upwards transfer of wealth, and it sparked conversations about the pursuit of more equitable and sustainable models of development. Now, as we know, moments of crisis can encourage us to hearken back to earlier periods when life was more stable and prosperous. In Egypt, this kind of nostalgia has existed for the Nasserist period for various reasons. As Amr Adli, an Egyptian political economist, a friend of mine and friend of some of you here today, as he wrote years ago, the only social contract present in the imagination of many Egyptians is purely Nasserist. Now, at the time of the revolution, I had read a fair amount of critiques of the Nasserist project, especially from Egyptian communists in the late 1960s and 1970s. I knew that the project suffered from various problems and contradictions, and my decision to write this book was, in part, motivated by a desire to envision a future beyond neoliberalism that did not simply entail a return to an imagined golden age. And I believe that doing so required an examination of the origins of the post-colonial state in Egypt, and especially the shape that it took under Nasser. Now, to situate ourselves, let me say a few words about Egypt. Egypt represents a slightly atypical case of decolonization. In other parts of Africa and Asia, formal decolonization and post-colonial state formation began to unfold seriously from the late 40s to the 1960s. But in Egypt, like a few other places in the world as well, it began decades earlier. So let me offer just a basic chronology of modern Egyptian history to get us oriented. In 1882, British forces occupied Egypt and effectively ruled the country for the next 40 years. In 1919, a nationalist uprising swept the country, and Egypt was granted a limited form of independence by the British 3 years later. And over the next 2 decades, Egyptian politics were largely shaped by a struggle between the palace, the British embassy, and a nationalist movement that found its strongest expression in the Weft Party. Then in 1952, a group of military leaders known as the Free Officers seized power, abolished the monarchy, and began to transform the country into a post-colonial republic that would be led by Nasser. Now, my book covers the period from the 1920s to the 1960s, or what I call Egypt's long decolonization. During these decades, the Egyptian Nile Valley formed a crucial territorial component of what Sven Beckert has called a British-centered empire of cotton. This was an intensifying web of production and trade that oriented cotton fields in the American South and British India, the Egyptian Nile Valley, Northeast Brazil, towards export for British textile industries. Now, across this space, a variety of historical actors exercised control over cotton through their multi-sided interactions that connected rural landscapes around the world to manufacturing centers in England. The flows of people, ideas, goods, and money that forged the Egyptian Nile Valley's location in this wider imperial space were governed through a set of institutions whose owners and managers exercised different kinds of monopoly powers. Now, these included the owners of private agricultural estates, or izbas, It included the managers of state railways and the directors of large banks and export houses in the country's main port city, Alexandria. The 2 decades after World War I witnessed unprecedented volatilities in the movement of commodities, capital, prices, that resulted in a crisis of accumulation in the Egyptian Nile Valley. And during this period, a variety of actors tried to disarticulate the country from this imperial geography and to reorganize the management of agriculture, trade, and money on a national scale. As a result, national space began to grow in importance as a unit of calculation, planning, capital accumulation. Over the course of a century, then, the Egyptian Nile Valley was transformed from an important node in Britain's empire of cotton into a space in which economic life became increasingly organized through nationally scaled institutions and processes. And my book explores how this large-scale transformation played out on the level of people, networks, and institutions through which Egyptian cotton was rendered into a global commodity. Now, there's three main arguments that run through the book. I'll present them to you as a kind of list and then work through each argument one by one. Argument number one. In the period that I study, there was a major shift in Egyptian nationalist understandings of the political economy of imperialism that resituated its locus from circulation to production. And I'll say more about this later. Argument number two, this shift in the historical consciousness of the Egyptian nationalist movement emerged out of the material circumstances of depression and war in the 1930s and 1940s. Argument number three, this shift was part of a larger transition in Egypt from one kind of monopolistic capitalism to another, right? So the three arguments sort of follow from each other. Let me discuss each argument in turn, and then I'll say a few things about the final chapter in the book, and then situate the book within the wider historiography. So the first argument of the book is that Egyptian nationalist understandings of the political economy of imperialism and national sovereignty underwent a profound change in the middle of the 20th century. The existing literature is still marked by a strong developmentalist bias. There's a tendency to assume that from the start, Egyptian economic nationalists sought to industrialize the country in order to overcome colonial underdevelopment. And in doing so, scholars, I believe, have mistaken a historically specific problem in the post-war period, right, which is the problem of how developing countries could transition from primary export economies to industrial economies. Scholars have mistaken this historically specific problem in the post-war period to be an enduring challenge for Egyptian leaders since the 19th century. Now, these conventional narratives obscure a major transformation that happened in Egyptian nationalist consciousness in the age of decolonization. In the 1910s and 1920s, Egyptian economic nationalists largely understood the main threat posed by Western imperialism to be the dependence of millions of Egyptians on volatile foreign markets and capital. They were concerned with the exposure of Egyptians to price fluctuations, speculative bubbles, trade instabilities. And they understood these things to be intractable forces that came with being incorporated into a British-dominated capitalist world economy. For example, the 1916 Sidqi Commission, which is often regarded by historians as an early program for import substitution industrialization. Well, this commission advocated agricultural diversification and limited industrial production. But it did so, it advocated these things in order to counter the effects of wartime trade instabilities on Egyptian. It did not seek to transform Egypt into what it called an industrial country of factories that billow smoke. Rather, it envisaged industry as a means to come to the aid of agriculture and not to supplant it. Right? This is a direct quote from the report of the commission. By the 1920s, nationalists like Talat Harb, Yusuf Nahas, Ibrahim Rashad were concerned with controlling the movements of prices, capital, and goods to which the livelihoods of Egyptians were attached. Harb co-founded Bank Misr, a business conglomerate that became a symbol of national economic development in the interwar period. But at its inaugural meeting, Harb spoke about the importance of what he called autochthonous capital rather than industrial capital per se. Right? Now, by the 1940s and 50s, however, a new generation understood the main threat of imperialism to be something different. It understood it to be the stagnant productive capacities imposed on Egypt by an alliance of imperial financial interests and local landed oligarchs that controlled the country's agricultural wealth. In the 1940s, Egyptian left nationalists, Marxists, and development economists began to theorize the condition of colonial underdevelopment in their country. They adopted new categories like monopoly capital, feudalism, to understand Egyptian political economy and, by extension, Egyptian history. Now, a key figure in this process was economist Rashid al-Barrawi, with whom I opened the book. Al-Barrawi was part of a generation of Egyptians who studied abroad, returned to Egypt, and introduced new ideas about development into the political grammar of the nationalist movement. He translated Marx, Engels, and Lenin into Arabic. He co-authored one of the first economic histories of modern Egypt, and he introduced new ideas about land reform, industrialization, and historical development. The officers who took power in 1952 were shaped by this political and intellectual climate. They embraced a project that equated national liberation with national development, and this became a core feature of Nasserism. In doing so, the officers were profoundly shaped by the productivist understandings of Egyptian political economy and history that began to spread in the preceding years. After the revolution, Anwar Sadat, a member of the Free Officers and the future president of Egypt after Nasser's death, he wrote that, quote, the Egyptian people had to storm 2 Bastilles to achieve their revolution. Feudalism was one, British imperialism was the other. But once one fortress was breached, the other was sure to crumble. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, the foundational documents of the Officers' Republic, like the 1956 Constitution, the 1962 National Charter, they identified the elimination of feudalism, imperialism, and monopoly capital as a central imperative, and championed a project of import substitution industrialization. Over a few decades, then, the perceived locus of imperial domination largely shifted from the realm of circulation to the realm of production. As a result, commercial agriculture, cash crops, and landed oligarchs became viewed with suspicion by a nationalist movement that increasingly valorized industrial capitalism. In the book, I follow these transformations over 4 decades, which, like I said, I call Egypt's long decolonization. Let's move to the second argument. What explains this transformation in nationalist consciousness? Well, in the book, I argue that the shift from a circulation-centered to a production-centered conception of imperial domination resulted from the experience of depression and war in the 1930s and 1940s. And this had both material and intellectual dimensions. The depression and war led to the devastation of cash crops, the impoverishment of peasants, the collapse of rural credit, the spread of agrarian rentierism, and the wartime growth of urban industries and populations. It also encouraged the interpretation of those conditions through new transnational ideas about development. The combination of these material and intellectual circumstances ultimately nurtured the ideas, concepts, and concerns that came to form the corpus of Nasserism. So let's take a closer look at the consequences of the Depression and war in Egypt. The Great Depression had a massive impact on Egyptian society and politics. In 1930, the average price of Egyptian cotton dropped by nearly 40% from what it was the previous year. And by 1933, the value of the cotton harvest fell to the lowest it had been since World War I. Now, the precipitous collapse of cotton prices meant a sharp decline in the incomes of Egyptian cultivators. For large landowners, the depression meant a mortgage crisis, as European-owned banks began to foreclose their properties that had been collateralized. The landowners effectively lobbied the Egyptian government to enforce a series of settlements that protected them and led to the eventual demise of these banks. And as a result, the circuits of agrarian finance that underpinned Egyptian cotton production fundamentally transformed. During the war, British authorities reoccupied the country. They placed restrictions on cotton acreage, and they promoted wartime urban industries that encouraged rural outmigration and drove up wages for agricultural labor. And this resulted in a kind of metamorphosis of Egypt's landed oligarchy, with reduced access to liquid capital, less land for cotton cultivation, and higher labor costs. Large landowners began to turn into a rentier class that relied more on leasing their land than on cultivating it directly. And this transformation was quite stark. In 1939, 17% of cultivated land was leased to tenants. By 1952, that ratio increased to 75%. Now, for small owners and tenants, the Depression meant growing burdens of rent, debt, and taxation, which brought to light the extent of rural misery in Egypt. The government began to promote rural reconstruction and rehabilitation through things like cooperative societies, agricultural banks, farming manuals, health and sanitation facilities, new rural social centers. And new ideas about peasant reform began to spread among prominent Egyptian writers and nationalists. Now, these changes in the prevailing modes of accumulation and political management in the Egyptian countryside would shape both the officers' perception of the old regime and their approach to the Egyptian peasantry after the revolution. Now, by the 1940s, these material transformations made possible a novel conception of development and history. New political groups, parties, and thinkers began to emerge in Egypt. Many of them did not come from the landed elite, and they harbored deep suspicions of the existing political and social order. They began to pursue agendas that were more radical than those adopted by earlier liberal nationalists. They drew on a mix of Fabian socialism, Marxism, development economics to fashion new political and socioeconomic objectives. They confronted British imperialism, social inequality, and economic underdevelopment as a single struggle. Their principal theorists introduced a framework for class analysis into Egyptian history and politics. Many of them reframed the question of national liberation as a problem of historical transition from one kind of society into another. They began to portray landowner rentiers as an unproductive feudal class that blocked the country's development. And they promoted land reform and capitalist industrialization as a pathway to genuine independence. As Egyptian nationalists and Marxists adopted a conception of imperialism and economic sovereignty that centered on production, they also constructed a new understanding of modern Egyptian history. In the 1940s and 50s, terms like feudalism, economic backwardness, monopoly capital began to pervade their writings, and they increasingly associated decolonization with the country's ascent to a higher stage of development. When they took power in 1952, the free officers claimed to be fulfilling this historical mission. Now let's turn to the third argument of the book. The history of Egypt between the 1920s and the 1960s is usually narrated as some kind of transition. The architects of Nasserism and their supporters understood it to be a transition from feudalism to socialism. Other historians often understand it to be a transition from laissez-faire capitalism to state capitalism. Building on the insights of scholars in the last 20 years, I propose a different way of narrating the history of decolonization in Egypt. I avoid any putative distinctions between the state and the economy, as well as any Manichaean binaries like backwardness versus progress, upon which these older narratives were founded. And instead, I argue that this period witnessed a transformation from a concessionary regime of accumulation that came into being in the late 19th century to a governmental or a bureaucratic regime of accumulation that was consolidated under Nasser in the 1950s and 1960s. Now, how does this framework help us to rethink the existing scholarship of this period? Well, let's start with my conception of capitalism, which I lay out in the introduction. So I understand capitalism to be a system of generalized commodity production in which people exchange the products of their labor and even their labor itself for the purpose of endless accumulation. Capitalism operates through two kinds of domination. The first one is direct domination by other people and institutions. This includes things like state violence, colonial plunder, and other extra economic activities. And the second one is indirect domination by the market. This includes impersonal compulsions that cannot be easily pinned down on any single individual or group. So things like competitive pressures that require people to work more, fluctuations in market prices, uneven movements of capital from one place to another, and so on. These two kinds of domination exist in a sort of constitutive tension with each other, and together they generate various kinds of inequality, instability, and unfreedom in capitalist society. Now, this understanding of capitalism informs the way I narrate the history of decolonization in Egypt. The institutions that dominated the production and trade of Egyptian cotton were what I call monopolistic domains. They were neither purely economic nor purely political. Rather, they leveraged the powers of the state to create domains in which they could engage in relatively uncompetitive, profitable activities. These institutions were not all monopolies in a narrow sense. Some of them were cartels, oligopolies, oligarchies. But what they had in common was that they all fashioned politically determined arenas of accumulation. And by this, I mean they were arenas for the accumulation of capital in which competition was often circumscribed by overtly legal or political mechanisms that enabled a small group of individuals or enterprises to make profits disproportionately. Now, if we think of the Egyptian Nile Valley as a vast plantation complex, its main monopolistic centers of power were, one, the landed oligarchy that owned large cotton estates, especially in the Nile Delta. Two, the state railways administration that moved cotton around the country. Three, the cartel of powerful cotton merchants in Alexandria. And four, the handful of European mortgage banks that financed the purchase of land. Now, all these domains were forged in the late 19th and early 20th century through preferential or concessionary arrangements of different sorts. By the 1950s and 60s, these monopolistic domains had fundamentally transformed. The private agricultural estates, or ezbas, on which cotton was produced, eventually gave way to a countrywide system of rural cooperatives that allowed the state to extract surpluses from Egyptian peasants, right, which was another kind of monopolistic domain. The same can be said about the replacement of European-owned mortgage companies by state-run agricultural bank that managed the provision of seeds and fertilizers and credit across the country, or the state railways that were subordinated to a program of road development, or the powerful cotton trading houses in Alexandria that were merged into 6 public enterprises, or the networks of imperial finance which helped transform the Egyptian countryside into a cash crop plantation that were replaced in the mid-20th century by a program of national development, which was still sponsored by foreign aid and assistance during the Cold War. Now, none of these institutions and arrangements existed exclusively within the state or the market. They all contained hybrid forms of political and economic activities and domination. In the end, the consolidation of power by the free officers did not represent a rupture between a feudal past and a socialist future, nor did it represent a movement from free markets to state intervention. Rather, it represented a shift from a regime of concessionary accumulation based on these sort of hybrid monopolies that were labor-intensive, imperially scaled, less centralized, and rooted in these islands of exceptional authority, into a regime of governmental or bureaucratic accumulation that was based on hybrid monopolies that were capital intensive, nationally scaled, more centralized, and intrusive into everyday peasant life. Now, this shift was often misrecognized as a transition from feudalism to socialism or from free markets to states. In reality, it was a transition from one kind of politically determined capitalist monopoly into another. So this is how I narrate the period of long decolonization in Egypt over half a century. Now, let me say a few words about the end of the story. Why did the Nasserist development project fail? Well, like I said, Nasserism largely equated national liberation with national development. Across the decolonizing world, the pursuit of national development led to, or often led to, a basic paradox. Newly independent countries aimed to create their domestic industries that could only operate, at least initially, with imports of technology, capital, and intermediate goods. Between 1945 and 1970, for example, the purchase of capital goods in Egypt increased from 13.5% to 31 or 32% of total imports. This meant that to industrialize, these countries needed hard currency. They needed dollars, they needed sterling in order to purchase these inputs, especially from the West. Because of the global structures of unequal exchange, large inflows of hard currency into developing countries typically happened after those countries could competitively produce manufactured goods for Western markets. In other words, the main ingredient that post-colonial states needed to industrialize, i.e. hard currency, could only exist in abundance after they had successfully industrialized. Now, to overcome this paradox, many developing countries relied on what I call political transfers of value. These included aid, rents, subsidies, expropriations, barter exchanges, and other kinds of transfers that did not go through conventional markets. For example, Nasser's Egypt relied heavily on food aid from the United States, rents from the Suez Canal, preferential trade agreements with the Soviet Union, and the compulsory delivery of cotton by peasants to state-run collection centers. Now, these political transfers combined with conventional exports to either allow the officers to earn hard currency on international markets or obviate their need to do so by supplying them with capital through non-market mechanisms. Now, because cotton and cotton-made goods were the primary source of export earnings for Egypt, the free officers created a massive bureaucracy to manage the production, trade, and processing of cotton. And doing so was essential for their ability to acquire the inputs for national development. After they extracted cotton from Egyptian peasants, there were really three things that the officers could do with that cotton. First, they could export raw cotton to earn foreign exchange that was necessary for development. But they faced political impediments, right? These included American trade restrictions that resulted from the opposition of Southern growers who viewed Egyptian cotton as a potentially dangerous competitor. They also included powerful American foreign policy makers like Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, who used trade quotes and threats thereof as a tool to discipline Nasser. As a result, U.S. import quotas on Egyptian cotton were imposed from the early 1940s and lasted even through the mid 1960s. So that was one option, but clearly faced obstacles. Second, the officers could process raw cotton into textiles and then export the textiles for foreign exchange. But there were several obstacles to doing that as well. Processing high-quality Egyptian cotton required advanced machinery that was imported from abroad, and this put further strains on the country's foreign exchange reserves. And B, Western countries enforced trade quotas which reduced the amount of textiles that developing countries could export to the United States and Western Europe. In the late 1950s, for example, Japan, India, Egypt, and other countries began to significantly increase their textile exports to Western markets. By the turn of the decade, American imports of Egyptian cotton textiles had grown exponentially. And this led the United States and the United Kingdom to take action against what they, at the time, called market disruption, right? Which was really a euphemism for non-Western countries getting better at industrialization. They enacted a series of agreements in the early 1960s that limited the sale of mechanically produced textiles to Western countries. As a result, the export of cotton textiles from the developing world to OECD countries in the 1960s grew at a slower rate than any other manufactured export. Although developing countries that engaged in trade with the capitalist bloc ostensibly participated in a regime of free trade, their ability to do so was politically circumscribed by Western powers. Okay, so that's the second option and the problems with it. And then third, the officers could engage in barter exchange with countries that did not require payment in hard currency for military and capital goods. Egypt began to do this with Eastern Bloc countries in the mid-50s and with the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s. This allowed Egypt to finance its military defense and industrialization programs. It became increasingly important as the other two ways of turning raw cotton into hard currency were restricted by Western powers. By the end of the 1950s, Egypt was sending almost half of its cotton to the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and China, for the first time exceeding the amount that was exported to Western Europe. The barter of cotton allowed the officers to acquire weapons for military defense, like they did with the Egyptian-Czechoslovak arms deal in 1955, as well as inputs for industrialization under its five-year plan. But relying on barter exchange to obviate the need for hard currency had its own costs as well. The Free Officers' project of endless growth, driven by import substitution industrialization, ironically made the country more reliant on the subsidies of global superpowers. By the mid-1960s, Egypt had accumulated heavy foreign debts, especially to the Soviet Union, and faced balance of payments crises. Now, in the late 1960s and 70s, Egyptian neo-Marxists and new leftists and dependency theorists began to understand these problems with the Nasserist project. Many of them rejected the term feudalism to describe pre-revolutionary Egypt, and some of them argued that by portraying themselves as revolutionaries against backwardness, the Free Officers and their allies sort of concealed the history of capitalist development in Egypt since the 19th century, as well as the class character of their own regime. For example, Egyptian Marxist Ibrahim Fethi believed that the Nasserist system was dominated by what he called a bureaucratic bourgeoisie, or what others later called a state bourgeoisie, that deployed state institutions, agencies, and policies to engage in the endless accumulation of capital. Others argued that the officers embraced a growth model that ultimately reinscribed the country's subordinate position in the capitalist world economy. For example, Mahmoud Hussein, which was the pen name of a pair of Egyptian Marxists who wrote in the 1970s. Mahmoud Hussein wrote that the Nasserist state could only realize its objectives with the massive capital and technical assistance of imperial powers. Now, my book builds on these kinds of critiques of Nasserism. It traces the roots of the Nasserist conception of national development and shows that the project was ultimately compromised by the country's dependence on global superpowers. But I also argue that the project's contradictions were often concealed by a narrative that misrepresented the country as moving from feudalism to socialism rather than from one kind of capitalism to another. Now, after they took power in 1952, the Free Officers still understood themselves to be struggling for independence in an imperial world. But they had a particular understanding of what that meant. Theorists of imperialism like Samir Amin and Giovanni Arrighi often differentiate between two dimensions of imperialism. The first is a territorial dimension that operates through the geographic expansion of imperial military power. And the second is an economic dimension that operates through the endless pursuit of profits. Now, if we accept this distinction, we might say that the Free Officers tended to confront imperialism geopolitically, but underestimate it economically. Nasser read a lot of grand strategy. He opposed the continued presence of British troops in the Suez Canal zone. He refused to join Western military alliances like the Baghdad Pact. And he understood the dangers of being too closely aligned in the Cold War. In other words, he had an astute geopolitical understanding of the post-war global landscape which formed a core part of the regime's ideology. For example, Nasser formally adopted and promoted the foreign policy concept of positive neutrality or non-alignment after 1955. What the officers and their allies did not adequately theorize or confront was the fact that imperialism continued to exist in political economic terms, even in an age of formal independence. The free officers had no equivalent to positive neutrality in the realm of economic policy. They had no explicit doctrine that could explain in systematic terms why Egypt continued to occupy a dependent position in the world capitalist system and how to overcome it. If they had an economic ideology, it tended to be temporally oriented rather than spatially oriented. It posited that Arab socialism represented a triumph over an archaic imperial feudal past, but it did not sufficiently grapple with how the pursuit of national development remained limited by the economic strictures of the post-war international order. In short, the ideological pronouncements of the Nasserist state tended to obscure the country's subordinate position in global space by misconstruing its place in historical time. In the end, the structures of unequal exchange that had long subordinated Egypt on a world scale continued to hamper the ability of the officers to pursue national development. The country's military defeat by Israel in 1967 sounded the death knell for Nasserism. It constricted the flows of rent and aid upon which the officers depended. The United States halted its food aid to Egypt. The closure of the Suez Canal prevented the collection of tolls from maritime traffic. And Israel's occupation of the Sinai Peninsula diminished revenues from both tourism and the production and sale of petroleum. At the same time, Egypt's debts to the Soviet Union became unwieldy and could no longer finance both military reconstruction and economic development. And the success of the Nasserist project, I think, ultimately depended on the ability of the officers to access political transfers of value and the willingness of global superpowers to provide them. But once those vital subsidies slowed down or were terminated, the project was no longer sustainable in the same way. Now, let me just conclude by placing the book within two wider historiographies. First, it makes an intervention into the history of Egypt and the history of decolonization in the Middle East. I think there are very few histories of agrarian capitalism in Egypt in the mid-20th century. The existing literature on capitalist development and decolonization in this period tends to look at individual investors, enterprises, business coalitions, and they focus overwhelmingly on urban centers. By contrast, Harvests of Liberation shifts our attention to agrarian capitalism. It examines the ways in which it was experienced on the level of everyday life, in the villages, towns, markets where cotton was produced and traded, as well as how it shaped the minds of anti-colonial leaders, intellectuals, and activists. And in doing so, it offers an account of Egypt's long decolonization and analyzes the historical circumstances that made the Nasserist vision of national development both conceptually plausible as well as structurally constrained. And second, it makes an intervention into histories of global capitalism, especially outside of the Euro-American world. In Egypt, we find a case study of the kinds of changes that colonial societies were undergoing in the middle of the 20th century. And the book provides an account of how global events like the Great Depression, the Second World War, transformed patterns of power and accumulation that had existed for decades on an important global commodity frontier, which is the Egyptian Nile Valley. And in doing so, it offers insights into how and why post-colonial states anchored their political legitimacy and a promise to deliver national development, as well as the potential pitfalls of such an endeavor. And I think that some of the insights that we gain from studying Egyptian history can shed light on similar histories of decolonization and national development in other parts of the world. So I'll stop there. I very much look forward to Jairus's comments and to opening up the discussion with members of the audience.
Great. Thank you so much, Ahmad. Let me now introduce our second respondent, Jairus Banaji. Jairus Banaji is with the Department of Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. and is currently working on a book titled The Peasantry and the Landless, a historical study of classes of labor. His most recent publications include A Brief History of Commercial Capitalism, which was published by Haymarket in 2020, Wanting Something Completely Different, 111 vignettes of left-wing figures, themes, films, and writers, which was published by Rub Rub in 2023, and A Marxist Mosaic, Selected Writings, 1968 to 2022, which was published by Brill in 2024. So, Jairus, over to you. You have about 20 minutes.
I just want to say
Yeah.
how much I enjoyed reading this book. I think it's a fantastic contribution to several historiographical traditions, not just histories of Egypt. And it's a major contribution to understanding the transition from pre-colonial to, rather, not from colonial or late colonial to post-colonial capitalism. And the idea of transitions from one form of capitalism to another is an extremely interesting one, I think. So what I'll do is just read out what I wrote in the last 2 days. I'll call Shokr Ahmad. Ahmad makes the interesting point that larger states drew male labor away from family farms, leaving the latter to be tended by women. He also notes that cotton was grown by various combinations of smallholders, tenants, and wage laborers, and crucially, there was never any neat distinction between these categories or groups. Now, why this is important is that it underscores the fluidity of class boundaries within the mass of the rural population, and also makes any simple notion of the peasantry problematic. This is also true for another reason, namely that by the late 40s, the bulk of the rural labor force was landless. They were either tenants or farm laborers, and in fact, tenants and farm laborers made up something like 80% of the rural population, which is why Warriner could claim that the majority of the fellahin are laborers, and this was in 1948, I think she made this statement. So in Hassan Riyad's 1964 monograph, L'Egypte Nasserienne, 73% of the rural population, some 2.8 million families, were said to be landless. Riyad was Samir Amin's pseudonym, and the book was published in, as I say, 64. Other estimates by Warriner, Abdel Fadil, and so on quote much lower figures, between 38 and 44%, but the point remains that landlessness was endemic to the countryside of Egypt to an extent even greater than, say, in India, where dispossession was partly institutionalized by caste. In 1981, Roger Owen published a famous paper about whether Egypt's larger estates, these are the Esba estates, Esbas being labor settlements on the estate, whether the larger estates could be characterized as capitalist operations. He was inclined to think that they were, but asked capitalism of what type, implying that there was no obvious model in Marxist theory for enterprises of this kind once the fiction of feudalism was set aside. Ahmed shows how the feudal narrative was simply a construct that emerged chiefly in the 40s as wartime regulations and the increase in rural wages undermined the larger states and led owners to switch to tenancy in a major way, turning post-war nationalists decisively against them and in favor of land reforms. About those estates, Ahmed notes that in Marxist theory, there is no obvious description for the resident workers on the large Esba estates who were called Tamaliya. There were these two categories of labor, namely permanently resident on the estate and then hired seasonally, the Tarahil workers, who were probably the most impoverished section of the rural population. But the Tamaliyas constitute the backbone of the estate. Probably the category that fits them best is labor tenancy, a form that was widespread on white farms in South Africa down to the 1920s, and also found in various parts of South America, where it went by different names. So I think the most plausible Marxist description for this kind of estate workforce is as labor tenancy. The wider regime that Ahmad describes so lucidly is a commercial capitalism that spans the whole period from the 1860s to the Depression. The beauty of the analysis is the way capital is disaggregated into what Sartre would have called a detotalized totality, describing the different sectors of capital, landed, commercial, finance, and state railways, as monopolistic domains that were never purely economic in the sense that their operations depended on state backing and specific government policies, and then mapping the tensions that developed between those sectors and within them. A major source of tension between cotton producers and merchants was that AGPA, the Alexandria General Produce Association, the first outcome of Britain's occupation of Egypt and the most powerful body in the cotton market, functioned as a cartel that allowed the same 60 traders to dominate both segments of the market, spot purchases as well as futures, using high volumes of trading on the futures market to affect produce prices and maximize volatility. In other words, commercial capital, that is merchants and brokers, had an active interest in price volatility. Much of the analysis is taken from Yusuf Nahas, an incredibly perceptive organic intellectual of the landlord class. Nahas has also left us with a very fine description of the way the estates were organized and the forms of exploitation that existed within these Esba estates. Chapter 3 on the Depression will count as one of our best analyses of what the 1930s looked like in parts of the colonial or semi-colonial world. In Indochina, the French rubber planters had to be bailed out to the extent of billions of francs. Not so Egypt, where the Depression broke the power of the export houses, but left the highly concentrated finance capital sector in a stronger position as a mortgage crisis loomed that threatened the country's agrarian oligarchy with foreclosures and fueled one nationalist backlash against the General Egyptian Agricultural Syndicate, a purely agrarian lobby whose general secretary was Nahas. So basically, this is the earlier generation of nationalism, if you like, belonging to the 20s, when the focus is very much on circulation as opposed to production. And the idea is to somehow disarticulate from the structures of world economy in a way that leaves Egypt in a better position. By the 1940s, a dramatic reversal had set in, with younger nationalists, many of them on the left, targeting the landowners as, quote, feudal and, quote, parasitic, and imagining a future for Egypt that was no longer purely dependent on its agrarian sector. Meanwhile, Egyptian capitalists had emerged and become stronger in the interwar years. But one thing that strikes me reading this book is the contrast between, say, the development of industrial capitalism in India and the corresponding development of anything like industrial capitalism in Egypt. I mean, there's a disproportionately greater development of industrial capital in the Indian context. And I'm sure that taking a cue from this analysis, that's a way in which one can understand the national movement itself in India, but this idea of navigating between the material and the intellectual or political, of drawing a kind of material context for the development of political ideas. The very substantial development of industrial capital in India, in contrast to, say, what we see in Egypt. But nonetheless, there were Egyptian capitalists emerging from the 1920s onwards. The idea in Egypt as elsewhere was that modern large-scale industry would draw workers away from the land, absorbing quote-unquote surplus labor, but financing imports of machinery and armaments with foreign exchange earned by extending state control over the production and export of cotton by smallholders. If you like, the peasantry would now be more tightly subsumed into a monolithic capital, namely the state. Nasser's regime replaced the country's subordination to commercial capital and the foreign banks with new forms of dependence on the two post-war global superpowers, on external aid, preferential trade agreements, and foreign direct investment. All this is described with clarity and in detail. It works as a more radical critique of Nasserism than Samir Amin had been able to advance in the early 60s, because Ahmad seems to suggest that the great delusion in the whole post-colonial agenda was the very idea that something like, quote, national development was at all possible, given the way the world economy was structured, and is structured, of course. Now, this is a brilliant book, the best treatment of its subject since Owen published his classic in the 60s, not least for the way it navigates between political ideas and their material contexts. So in conclusion, just one or two remarks of a more critical nature. Chapter 1, which describes the machinery of Egypt's subjection to the forces of commercial capitalism, could have included some reference to the actual penetration of capitalism into the countryside, which came about as Greeks settled even in the smallest villages of the Delta and Middle Egypt to finance cotton growing by smallholders at exorbitant rates of interest. The bulk of peasant debt was owed to these moneylenders, who later came to own large expanses of land as they foreclosed on loans and dispossessed households. They were the, quote, low-class Greeks that Cromer despised, and much of the rural violence in 1882 was directed precisely against them. The reason I bring this up is that if we're going to have the kind of disaggregated but complex picture of the way capitalism worked in Egypt, in the way that Ahmad tries to describe in this book, I think we have to address the issue of supply chains and the actual way in which capital circulates from the village level all the way up to the cotton market in Alexandria. The supply chains which allow for this movement of capital, of commodities and of capital from one level to the other. We have to be able to describe those supply chains in a more concrete way. And one of the starting points, obviously, for these supply chains is the financing of cotton, insofar as smallholders are the growers of cotton. And obviously, smallholders are growing cotton, financing the production of cotton with debt. And secondly, Ahmad refers repeatedly to uneven forms of exchange and uneven exchange, expressions that I find mystifying. The nationalist critique of England's domination of Egypt revolved in part around what in the Indian literature is called the drain theory. And there is the constant references to drain throughout the book, in other words, as part of the nationalist critique of what England was doing to Egypt. The moment of truth in this particular view of the nature of colonial exploitation lies in what, from the 70s of the last century, the left called unequal exchange. In a world where massive wage disparities are institutionally entrenched, trade between countries is bound to involve transfers of value from the country with lower wages to the one with higher wages. Wages are the independent variable in the system. As Emmanuel wrote, quote, the capitalist world cannot show a single instance of a high-wage country that has had to reduce wages owing to failure to develop, or a single instance of a country that's been able to develop while keeping wages low. So basically, in terms of reimagining a program for the left, it seems to me that the kind of critique that Emmanuel developed in 1969, when Unequal Exchange was published in France, has to be one of the starting points for any serious understanding of a left, of a revolutionary or a socialist program today. I mean, the world economy remains as deeply flawed in terms of subordination, dependence, and inequality today as it was in the 19th century. And going back to the small grower, it's not clear what Roger Owen meant by saying, and I mention this because Owen is actually quoted by Ahmad at one point in the book as saying this, that there isn't enough evidence to determine if merchant moneylenders consistently underpaid cultivators. Owen's extraordinary assertion reads, there is not enough evidence to make out a general case that they were consistently underpaid. I just don't understand that statement. Not enough evidence to make out a general case that they were consistently underpaid. What counts as being underpaid? How does one measure this? Ahmad cites Nahas's estimate that middlemen swallowed about half the price that manufacturers paid for Egyptian cotton. Now, Owen published Cotton and the Egyptian Economy in 1969, which happens to be the same year that saw the French original of Emmanuel's Unequal Exchange. So basically, if he had read Emmanuel, for example, which he hadn't, I think the whole issue could have been framed in a different way. You can't talk about our cultivators in third world countries and so on consistently underpaid when there are huge, enormous, massive transfers of value occurring from some parts of the world to other parts of the world because of unequal rates of surplus value. Okay, not because of unequal levels of organic composition of capital, which is the argument that is acceptable. It's perfectly acceptable, but that's not the substance of unequal exchange. The substance of unequal exchange lies in wage disparities, which are persistent and entrenched and which have not been changed for the last 2 centuries. Now, that price support or cotton buying campaigns became crucial to the fortunes of producers in the 1920s is one of the earliest indications we have historically of how the very viability of agriculture under capitalism becomes inseparable from subsidies and state interventions of various kinds. Something that will become starkly obvious in the latter part of the 20th century, whether one looks at US farmers and farm lobbies, and that's Trump, for example, who's just negotiated a deal with China, which will allow the export of soybean, peasants in various parts of India, or large commercialized farms and dairy producers in the EU. The state is now seen as crucial to the viability of farming under capitalism, and Egyptian cotton, in Ahmad's analysis of it, is a frontrunner in terms of early historical examples of this. Now, just a final point, going back to this thing about the fluidity of class relations within the countryside. I've always been struck by something that in one of my papers I call the vulnerability of the peasantry in Egypt. All right. I mean, this is an argument that can be stretched back centuries and centuries. It goes back, in fact, to late antiquity, when a very large part of the rural population was effectively landless and sought employment on large estates, sought some degree of job security on large estates, which were very similarly structured to the esbas of the 19th and 20th century. The esba then was, instead of being called esba, obviously it was called an epoikion in Greek. All right, these labor settlements were epoikia. They're very similar in structure to what we see in emerging against the background of irrigation, perennial irrigation in the late 19th century. But to take this point of vulnerability of the rural population, I mean, fast forward by something like 2 or 3 decades from the Nasserism that Ahmad is critiquing so effectively in this book, and you come to what's it called? Law 96 or something of 1992, is that right? Law 96 of 1992, which effectively not just reverses the very limited land reform of the 1950s and 60s, but then goes on, presses ahead to evict something close to 1 million tenants in the country in the course of the 90s. That is a colossal scale of eviction and dispossession. No other country has anything vaguely similar to what Egypt saw in the 1990s. Now, of course, this is part of the neoliberal agenda and so on and so forth. But it's interesting that, if you like, this is another sense in which Nasserism actually failed. It's a longer term sense in which Nasserism failed because the land reform was so limited and unambitious. All right, not only did it compensate the large estate owners, but it handed out something like 2 to 5 fedans apiece to small owners, right? You can't survive on 5 fedans. You can barely survive on 5 fedans. So it seems to me that the kind of subjugation of the peasantry, of the countryside to the cities, of the countryside to commercial and urban capital is something that, continues through the late 20th century, and until we come to this particular watershed, this amazing reversal of things which you see with the law 96 of 1992. Tenants are just removed en masse, and much of the land is handed back to the second generation or third generation of the very owners who were ostensibly expropriated in the 50s and 60s. So if you like, there's a counter-revolution. Not only did Nasserism fail, but what one actually saw was a kind of anti-Nasserist counter-revolution in the 1990s. Okay.
Okay, thanks so much, Jairus. Ahmad, would you like to take 10 minutes to respond to both what Jairus said and what Sven said earlier?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, this is such a rich body of comments that's given me so much to think with, and I wish I could spend more time with it and come back with a more developed response. But I'll look through. I took 2.5 pages of notes as Jairus and Sven were speaking, so I'll look through them and try to answer what I can. So, Jairus, well, let me begin with one of the critical comments. So, the term uneven forms of exchange that I use throughout the text. The reason I chose that phrase is because when I initially formulated that phrase, I was talking about the nationalist critique of circulation in the 1910s and 1920s. And it's a critique of circulation, but it's not a critique that is grounded in the dynamics of an uneven or unequal international division of labor, right? In the way that the critique made by Prebisch and the Cepelinos and dependency theories in the second half of the 20th century would be. And so I wanted to formulate a phrase that could that could capture inequality of exchange, but without imposing a category that emerges later, by Prebisch and others on this earlier generation of nationalists. I think I do. The only point in the book where I use the phrase unequal exchange is in the footnotes when I'm citing Samir Amin and Argiri Emanuel and others. And in general, I agree with you. I mean, I understand one of Argiri Emanuel's major contributions to be the fact that he pointed to wage disparities as being the thing that drives unequal exchange. That was his major critique of the Prebisch Singer thesis or version of unequal exchange that sort of just treated it as a function of demand in markets rather than something that was rooted in wage disparity. Although Samir Amin, I think, believes that Prebisch was unfairly critiqued, that it was more Singer who was responsible for that. But in general, I agree with this. So these are the reasons that I didn't use the phrase in the book. And I also agree that I mean, it's obvious that Egyptian cultivators are underpaid throughout the entire duration of the period that I'm talking about. I do cite Owen where he says that he wasn't able to determine to what degree exactly they were underpaid. I think there's a lot of qualitative and even quantitative evidence to substantiate the claim that they were being underpaid. In general, sometimes it's difficult to identify how sort of fluctuations in wages occurred over different periods of time. I had trouble, gathering data that would allow me to, make more detailed arguments of that sort. But as a general characterization of the entire period, I don't disagree at all. In terms of Owen's article on capitalism of what type that he published, yeah, that's a fascinating article. It's one that I continue teaching to my students because it's instructive, I think, in dealing with these issues. Now, Owen's conclusion in that article, if I remember correctly, is that Egypt represented a case of what he calls capitalism without capitalists, right? It was capitalist in the sense that it was integrated into a broader capitalist world economy that was centered around Britain at the time. But at the same time, for him, Izba owners don't behave in the typical way that capitalists do because they continue to rely on extra economic violence on their estates, because he says that the existence of competitive markets for wage labor and land in the form of competitive leases was not widespread enough. And so this leads him to this conclusion that Egypt represented a case of capitalism without capitalists. I definitely disagree with that. I mean, as I lay out in the book from the very beginning, I don't see the presence of extra economic coercion as something that is a defining feature of whether a social formation is capitalist or not. I mean, like I said in the beginning, for me, the defining feature is that you have a system of generalized commodity production that's oriented towards endless accumulation. And within that, many different kinds of labor regimes and state practices and markets and so on can exist. In terms of your point about merchants and brokers having an active interest in price volatility, I think so. Absolutely. I say that in the book, and I think it's very important because that was one of the features of Egypt's agrarian political economy that nationalists were contending with in the 1920s. And I think this gets left out of a lot of conventional accounts of Egyptian political economy in this period that tend to assume that from the outset, nationalists like Talat Harb and others had an orientation towards domestic industrialization. Whereas what I see in the sources that I read is that they were very, very concerned with the question of volatility, right? Whether it's volatile movements of capital in and out of the country that generate something like the financial crash of 1907, which was a profoundly influential event that shaped that earlier generation of nationalists, or the price volatility of cotton on global markets, which of course reaches unprecedented proportions after World War I and the larger kind of changes in the global political economy that happened after World War I. So these are the kinds of concerns that nationalists are grappling with throughout the 1920s. And by centering those concerns, I was able to present a different account of this change in nationalist consciousness over several decades that I was laying out earlier. Now, in terms of Sven Beckert's comments, so the comment about there being overlaps between these two generations of nationalists, those who were largely focused with circulation and those who then turned to production. I think I largely agree with Sven. I mean, there are important overlaps there. I think Sven mentioned the necessity of capturing state power, and also they all shared a view that formal political independence was not enough to achieve genuine sovereignty, right? They all operate from the premise that genuine sovereignty requires more than just achieving formal political independence. It also demands a substantial transformation in the everyday behaviors of Egyptians, as well as their relationships with the world beyond them, and especially the relationship between Egypt and Britain. So that is a kind of starting premise that exists across these two generations. How they understand the dynamics of imperialism and how to confront it then change. And I don't want to present this change in very stark black and white terms. I mean, history is always, much more complex than these sort of neat divisions would suggest. But I think by and large, we can detect this sort of change that I'm outlining in the book over the course of several decades. The role of the Mahalla Spinning and Weaving Company that's founded in 1927. So Sven's right that I don't spend a lot of time talking about it, and it's because I had to make a decision at some point that the book was going to focus largely on agrarian capitalism, simply because including everything that I wanted to include would have made it a much longer book, and that wasn't viable for many different reasons. And there's also a pretty substantial existing literature on the history of that company and Talat Harb and its industrial activities, from the late 20s through the 1930s and into the 40s. And I cite that literature in the footnotes. Now, when I mention the company briefly in the context of industry without industrialization, what I mean is that I think of industrialization in the sense that development economists would talk about it in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, right? So I'm thinking people like W. Arthur Lewis or Walt Whitman Rostow, right? These very well-known development economists that emerge in the post-war period and are thinking very much in terms of a transition from a primary export to an industrial economy, and industry kind of supplanting agriculture as the primary sector in economy as an optimal mode of development. That's what I mean when I say industrialization. That's not the vision of development that nationalists have in the 1910s and 1920s, including nationalists like Talat Harb, who was probably the most enthusiastic about industrial development out of that entire cohort in the 1920s. But even Talat Harb, when you read his writings, never suggests that industry is a form of activity that should eventually supplant agriculture, or that an industrial sector of an economy necessarily needs to be bigger or of more significance than an agricultural sector. And the reasons that diversification and limited industrialization or building of industries would have been appealing to him was not to overcome the backwardness of the agrarian sector. It was to deal with these other instabilities of trade and movements of capital in and out of the country, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, I think there was one or two more. Yeah, the state being hard to grasp throughout the text and underanalyzed. I think that's true, but also the reason it's underanalyzed, I think, is because I'm trying throughout the text, and I say this explicitly in the introduction, to avoid any kind of distinction between the state and the market, and instead to think about the intertwining of political and economic processes together and how they're configured in different ways depending on the regime of accumulation and the phase of Egyptian history that we're talking about. So that was the way in which I chose to present things. It might come at the expense of some analysis and deeper theorization of what exactly makes up the state. But I think that's maybe a cost that I had to pay as an author in order to make these other set of analytical moves that I wanted to do in the book. There's many other things. There's many other notes that I've taken and issues that came up that I can address. But in the interest of time, because we have 20 minutes left, I think I'll stop here and so that we have an opportunity to hear questions from the audience.
Yeah, we actually have 4 very interesting questions. I'll put 2 to you first, and hopefully perhaps Jairus will join us as well. So let me ask the first question from Shrishti Sethi. So Shrishti is saying that Ahmad has written about the making of a nationalist and anti-imperialist ideology around the relations of production and exchange of cotton in interwar Egypt. Do we see similar ideologies related to cotton developing in other parts of the colonized globe at the same time in Asia, Africa, or Latin America? And what does this comparative angle tell us about the specificity of the Nasserist understanding of the place of cotton within imperialism and anti-colonialism? So that's the first question. The second question, which I thought went well with this, is from an anonymous attendee. The question is, cotton production globally often went hand in hand with the development of railways, shipping, and other forms of transporting cotton to the imperial center. How did nationalist and anti-imperialist intellectuals understand these forms of transportation, which were presumably built and monopolized by the imperial powers, and their role in nationalism or anti-imperialism? I'm thinking here particularly of Nasser's rhetoric around the nationalization of the Suez Canal, or Nehru's nationalization of the railways, for instance. So the 2 quite extensive kind of questions. So would you like to respond to those first, and then we can take the other 2?
Sure, absolutely. So the role of cotton in nationalist consciousness and ideology in Egypt, I think there's definitely similarities with other contexts. I mean, Jairus mentioned the drain of wealth theory in India. I definitely see parallel similarities there, although some differences as well. I think the way the critique was formulated in Egypt was not such a direct attack on the Ricardian theory of comparative advantage, because there was still a sense among nationalists in the 1920s of cotton being the hub of national wealth and the basis of riches for Egypt and so on. But there's definitely a critique of the way that the value generated by the production and sale of cotton is sort of circulating out of Egyptian hands and into the hands of others. At the same time, I mean, Egypt, so like I said in my presentation, the United States, India, Egypt are the top 3 cotton producers. Of those 3 countries, Egypt is conforms the most to what you can describe as a monocrop economy, right? It's a much smaller country, obviously, than India and the United States, and cotton is just so central to everything about the Egyptian economy. Like I said, it constitutes between 70 and 80% of Egyptian exports. Those numbers start to decline over the course of the Nasserist period, but even by the end of the Nasserist period, cotton is still constituting about a half, if not a little more than a half of Egyptian exports. And so I think that is a somewhat unique feature of Egypt. And if we're talking about transportation, I mean, the fact that all of this cotton is moving through really one single port in Alexandria for the most part. It's another kind of unique feature of the Egyptian geography, and shapes the ways in which people are thinking about questions like how do you count cotton, how do you move cotton, these sorts of things. Now, in Nasserist understandings, I mean, I think that they come out of a set of circumstances that are both local and global. That are both local and global. So the local conditions we talked about in our discussion that I discuss in much greater depth in the book, things like the collapse of rural credit, the rise of agrarian rentiers, British wartime policy, the demise of the Izba system. I mean, these are all things that are quite contingent and unique to Egypt, but they're happening in a larger global context where the depression is devastating cash crop economies around the world. Ideas about development are circulating in the 1940s around the world. Of course, there's a larger shift from a British imperial world to an American imperial world that's playing out in all kinds of different ways and affecting thinking about development in all kinds of different contexts. But these things are happening in a shared world as well. And so I try to be sensitive to both the local and the global conditions out of which the Nasserist understanding of national development is emerging. And in doing it that way, we can both kind of it creates opportunities to both examine points of comparison with other projects of national development, but also think about what's specific to Egypt. The question of transportation. So I think the story of the nationalization of the Suez Canal is different. I mean, it's a centerpiece of Nasser's project in the 1950s, and his success in nationalizing the Suez Canal really represents a pretty serious blow to Western imperialism in the 1950s. I mean, the Suez Canal is one of the major arteries of world trade, and for a nationalist government to be able to exercise control over it, was no small challenge to imperialism in the 1950s and in the post-war period. It's a little different than the story I tell about. I mean, I mentioned the Suez Canal, I think, in the introduction. I don't really talk about it too much in the chapter on Nasserism, just because it's not as directly connected to the cotton economy. And what I was trying to do in that chapter is to evaluate the Nasserist experience through the prism of cotton in the same way that I'd been doing throughout the rest of the book. And in that sense, the major shift that's happening is the shift away from railroads towards roads as a way to move cotton around the country. And I spent some time talking about the different forces that were at work in that transition, and the different kind of multinational, corporate and governmental interests, including in the United States, that get involved in the 1950s in that transformation.
I'll ask another couple of questions from the audience, which are related to what you just said. So we have one question from Ahmad Shokr. Fahad asks, how did the business monopolistic character of cotton production, financing, transportation, and trade described by Ahmed compare to other contexts of cotton production over the globe, such as the American South, China, or South Asia? In particular, I'm interested in why cotton production took the form of landed estates and then peasant cooperatives in Egypt, rather than, say, company-owned plantations? And a second question, which is similar, is from Prabhu Mahapatra, which is, how do you connect the nationalist imagination based on circulation with the earlier history of modernization in the early 19th century under Muhammad Pasha, and the history of subsequent deindustrialization? So those are the two questions.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the first question, I see the first question up here. So when cotton production was getting started in Egypt in the 19th century, I mean, Egyptians were certainly aware of the wider world and, had some awareness of slave plantations in the American South and other, examples of how to produce a cash crop on such an immense industrial scale. I think that well, the way that private estates are introduced into Egypt is sort of very gradual over the course of the second half of the 19th century, and then especially the first few decades, the first few years of the 20th century when Azbaz grow dramatically. But in this period, Egypt is also subjected to the British occupation after 1882. And there's a very good book by my colleague, Aaron Jakes, called Egypt's Occupation. My colleague, Aaron Jakes, who I've also co-authored several pieces with on the history of capitalism in Egypt, the history of cotton. His book is called Egypt's Occupation. And one of the things that he finds is that the British were very concerned during the period of the occupation with strengthening the Egyptian smallholder, right? I think there was a long-held assumption in the literature that there was a kind of alliance between large Azbaz and the British, but actually small-holding peasants were very, very important for the British vision of what they were trying to do in Egypt and how to attain the kind of colonial development that they were pursuing, and were part of were central figures in a larger ideology that he describes as colonial economism, right? Where they believed that by making the sort of material gains of the occupation very palpable for Egypt's smallholders, this would secure their consent for foreign rule. And that the way to do this was to imagine Egypt as a kind of machine of even flows of credit and water and resources that could kind of operate in a machine-like fashion. And smallholders played a very important role in that. And then for the early generation of the nationalist movement, I mean, there's also this massive preoccupation with the smallholding peasantry and how to strengthen them. The British realize also early on that there's benefits to peasant small farms for the production of cotton, right? The gendered and generational division of labor that's imposed on the small farms, the labor of women, the labor of children, right, on family farms could actually be very useful for an enterprise like massive cash crop plantations. So these are some thoughts on that question. And then, of course, the institutionalization of peasant cooperatives takes several decades in Egypt. It achieves moderate success in the 30s, 40s, but really expands on a new level in the 1950s and especially in the 1960s under Nasser. There is an early debate about collectivization along the Soviet model versus cooperativization, but eventually, for reasons that I detail in the book, they settle on peasant cooperatives as the best way to scale up the management of peasant farms and continue to hit the production targets, especially for crops like cotton, that the Nasser state sees as necessary for its development program. The second question, sorry, Zain, I didn't write down the second question and I don't see it in the.
I'll just repeat it. So the question is, how do you connect the nationalist imagination based on circulation with the earlier history of modernization in the early 19th century under Muhammad Pasha, and the subsequent history of deindustrialization?
Yeah. So I think, well, first of all, there's no nationalist movement in Egypt in the 19th century, right? The nationalist movement really begins to emerge in the last few years of the 19th century, and then takes on a more institutional form after the 1907 crisis, and then, obviously through the 1910s and the 1920s. So there wouldn't be a direct point of comparison in the 19th century with the generation of nationalists that I'm talking about in the 1910s and the 1920s. That said, under Mehmet Ali Pasha, there was a kind of limited effort to pursue industrial development, and the idea of industry was certainly around in the 19th century. You find it in the writings of leading Egyptian scholars, translators who were central to the Nahda generation, people like Rifat Tahtawi. In fact, I have a colleague of mine who just completed a wonderful article tracing the etymology of the word industry in Arabic in Tahtawi's writings. Now, I would say a similar thing. I mean, when you read those writings in the 19th century, you don't come away with a sense that they're talking about replacing agriculture with industry, or that there's this notion that agriculture is somehow uh, an agricultural economy is less developed than an industrial one. I don't see that. I mean, in those writings, when they use the term industry, it's something more akin to like industrial spirit or industrial ethos that can exist in many different spheres of economic activity: agricultural, commercial, industrial. Um, as far as I remember, the term is originally translated from the writings of the Saint-Simonians, and that's how it makes its way into Egypt. But these are some of the earlier usages of the term. However, like I said, my colleague Amr Khairi is coming out with a wonderful article soon about the etymology of this term that sheds a lot of light on its existence and the work that it was doing in the 19th century.
Okay. We have one last question. And maybe if for both Ahmad and Jairus, if you'd like to also respond to it. It's a very interesting question which comes from Jeanette. So Ahmad, you spoke about the cotton producing peasantry in Egypt. What about textile factories and workers in the Nasserist period? How did the Nasserist state relate to them, given that indigenous textile factories using local cotton challenged the imperialist system of textile production and were thus presumably a vindication of Nasser's anti-imperialism? Did this allow the trade union movement in the textile sector to make particular claims on the state?
Yeah, so once again, when I was writing the book, I imagined it as something a lot more expensive than it ended up being. At a certain point in writing the book, I decided that I need to narrow the story around agriculture in order to be able to tell it in the level of richness and detail that I wanted to. However, I mean, textile workers are very important throughout the period I'm talking about, in the 30s all the way to the 60s. There is an existing literature, including some really wonderful books that give us a picture of what everyday life was like for textile workers and the importance of this new labor force in Egypt, and how its rhythms of life were just very different than things that came before it in the 1930s. The best book I can think of is a book by Hanan Hamed called Industrial Sexuality, which is a study of the Mahalla Spinning and Weaving Company in the 1920s, 1930s. And I mean, there's just so many wonderful things about that book. It's such a rich book. And one of the things that it does is it takes us beyond just the factory walls, right? And the point of production, and looks at Mahalla as a city and how, um, the emergence of the textile industry there really kind of uh, uh, restructured the city in terms of not just labor relations. Obviously, labor relations are key, but relations of gender, relations of landowning, urban landowning, and tenancy in the city, and so on and so forth. Now, if we fast forward to the Nasserist period, yeah, I mean, textile workers are very important. Textiles are Egypt's leading industrial sector. And by the end of the Nasserist period, industry comes to form a pretty significant part of the economy. And textiles are by far Egypt's leading export, I think accounting for 75% or so of Egypt's exports. Those workers who work in those largely state-run factories in the 1960s are a very important part of that. There's not, I mean, so one of the things that Nasser does is he absorbs trade unions into a state-run federation after 1957 and adopts this kind of corporatist strategy for the management of labor. So there is no independent union, so to speak, for much of the Nasserist period that I'm talking about. However, there is a vibrant workers' movement. And interestingly, a decisive a turning point in the early history of Nasserism happened in the early 1950s, where Nasser actually hung two textile workers who were part of a large strike at the Kafr Dawar textile factory. And this episode really shifted Nasser's early relationship with the communist movement in Egypt, many of whom turned against him for it. Relations between the Nasserist regime and the communists would remain pretty antagonistic until the mid-50s, when Nasser refused to join the Baghdad Pact and nationalized the Suez Canal, and then relationships warmed up once again.
Fascinating. Maybe the next book. Thank you so much, Ahmed. It's only left to me to, well, thank Ahmed, thank Jairus, and Sven in absentia for what has been a wonderfully productive and engaging seminar. So thank you to you all. In the next session of the Economic Histories of the Global South, to be held on Thursday, the 27th of November at the same time, we will discuss Timur Ruskola's forthcoming book, The Making of the Chinese Working Class, which charts the making of an urban proletariat in China over the past decades, comparing it with the making of the English working class in the 18th and 19th centuries. Our respondents, Chitra Joshi and Jonathan Hislop, will engage with Timur's historical arguments on the commodification of land, the enclosure movement, and the migration of labor from the countryside to the cities from the perspective of the regions they study, which are respectively South Asia and Southern Africa. So we hope very much that you can join us again next month. So we close the session here. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say sorry, my battery died on me, right?
Oh,
So
it's okay.
I had to move from one place to another to get back into this. So I wouldn't have been able to hear some part of your responses to the things that I was saying. I'd be happy to send you what I wrote, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
That'd be,
okay.
I'd greatly appreciate that.
And I want to repeat, I really enjoyed reading this book. It was a piece of pure lucidity, right?
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you, Jairus. I appreciate that. Actually, I can, do you have a minute to
Yeah,
ask
sure.
a question that's been on my mind? Because I was thinking about the drain of wealth, theorists in India, Naroji and others. And I mean, my understanding from the work of Manu Goswami and others that I've read is that they were very influenced by Friedrich List and the German historical school from a few decades earlier. And I was thinking about that when I was writing about people like Ibrahim Rashad and these figures in the 1920s who are very much making what appears to be a drain of wealth critique.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's not, unlike Friedrich List and unlike the thinkers in India, it's not a critique of Ricardian comparative advantage, right? It is a critique of the way that the value produced from cotton then circulates and seeps out of the hands of Egyptian, and the foreigner takes it and leaves the country. But it's not a critique of Ricardian comparative advantage in the sense that all these nationalists continue to affirm the importance of cotton as the primary source of Egyptian wealth. And so that's something I've been thinking through. I mean, I didn't include any of these observations in the book necessarily because I'm still thinking through them, but that is an interesting point of comparison with the Indian case in the late 19th century.
I think I mean, the drain theory is largely premised on the fiscal exploitation of India, right?
Right.
Massive
Right. Yeah.
amounts of revenue were being extracted
Right.
from producers and then transferred abroad through various mechanisms.
Right. Yeah.
Initially through the East India Company, and then later on after they lost their control over the country. Whereas
Right.
I don't think this fiscal aspect matters so much with Egypt. In that sense, yeah, in that sense, the regime that encompasses what you're talking about, and your focus is from the 20s to the 60s, right? But the wider regime that encompasses that is something that I've characterized as commercial capitalism. So it's
Right.
the export houses who are the kind of hub of this entire system that you're describing, right? With its
Yeah.
interlocking or intermoving parts, right?
Right.
The different monopolistic domains and so on and so forth. If you were to
Yeah.
try and identify a pivot, it would be commercial capital.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and British here means not just ethnically British, because the Greeks are very much part of this system.
Right.
They're the ones who effectively start the, AGPA. AGPA is essentially floated by something like 15 or 20 Greek merchants
Yeah.
initially. So it seems to me the big difference then is taxation versus non-taxation, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
the drain is approximates to the model of unequal exchange.
Yeah.
Which is why I was so intrigued by this statement about, are they consistently underpaid? What does it even mean to ask that?
Yeah.
I mean, you've got massive transfers of value from, that's one crucial assumption is required, which is that we see peasant labor as effectively a form of wage labor.
Right.
And by that, I mean that if we're talking about wage disparity in this context, then you have to treat cotton growing labor, the labor of resident workers and the labor of smallholders, as effectively equivalent to wage labor, right?
Yeah.
In other words,
Yeah.
they receive a wage.
Yeah. Yeah.
They receive a wage, and which is nothing compared to, say, the countries where all this transfer of value is occurring, okay? Which is being
Yeah.
sent, value is
Yeah.
being. So I think, anyway, we should have a look at Emmanuel again and see
Yeah.
how that framework works theoretically, because I haven't come across a convincing theory other than that one about why these disparities persist and they're so entrenched.
Yeah.
And you refer
Yeah.
repeatedly in the discussion to imperialism, but in the book itself, there isn't an actual discussion of what imperialism might mean, either then
Yeah.
or now, right?
No, not in the body of the text. There's a footnote about Argyri Emanuel and his critique of the Prebisch-Singer thesis, because that's his main critique, right? That Prebisch and Singer understand uneven exchange to be something that just emerges from like fluctuations of demand in the market rather than something that stems from wage disparities. And Amin as well, although Amin is a bit more sympathetic to Prebisch and thinks
Well,
that
Amin came out with a savage attack on Emmanuel about literally 3 or 4 years after.
yeah, that's the end of the debate piece that
That's
they went back.
that's the one which is about the law of value and unequal exchange or something.
Yeah, I remember
By
I
that
had
stage, he could publish under his own name, but in 64, when he wrote L'Egypte Nasserien, he was called Hassan Riyad, right?
Yeah, he was still Hassan Riyad.
I've got that here on my desk.
Yeah.
This
Oh
one.
yeah. Oh. Yeah, we're reading the same. Yeah. No, it's a wonderful book. And it's, as far as I know, it's the earliest instance I've found of the use of the concept of state capitalism or state bourgeoisie, which then gets developed into a central concept in the writing of Egyptian kind of neo-Marxists and new leftists in the 1970s. But this is the earliest mention. Now, Amin did an interview with a friend of mine years ago where he says that actually the term had been around since the mid-50s, but only in sort of dissertation theses, MA theses, because the people that were using these concepts in the 50s were still very young and were coming up as students. But the first published reference I've seen to state capitalism or state bourgeoisie in Egypt was
that one?
Yeah, this book.
Okay.
There's another book, Jairus. I don't know if you read Arabic, right, Jairus?
Well, I struggle with it. I mean, I learned it for my thesis and so on, but
Okay.
yeah, I'm not fluent I struggle with it, right?
I don't know if you've ever come across a book by Ibrahim Amir called Al-Ard wal-Fallah, Land and the Peasant. Uh, it's not a very well-known or broadly read book, but it's the best book I've read about
Really?
peasantry and rural Egypt that came out in the Nasser period. Now, of course,
Okay.
he was a communist and he was imprisoned in the big wave of arrests in 1959. And so he didn't want to write directly about the Nasserist period. So what he does, he publishes it in 1957, but it's a sort of sweeping history of agrarian social relations in modern Egypt over the 19th and
Okay.
20th century. And you could kind of extract insights about Nasserist Egypt from it. But
Do
it's a
you think
fantastic text.
it's there on Anna's archive, for example? Can one find it there?
It's a very, very hard text to find. I spent years, I mean, it exists in the Egyptian National Library, and then when I came here, I spent years looking for it, and finally, a library in France that has a copy scanned it for me and mailed me the
Great,
book
great.
paper.
So
So
needless to
I
say.
can send it to you. I digitized it and I can send it to
Oh,
you.
wow. Seriously?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. He had to do that.
And it was published in 57, did you say?
57, yeah,
And
yeah.
how does he handle the idea of feudalism?
He rejects it. He
Good.
rejects it. And he's one of the earliest people to do so. All right. I mean, so feudalism, it's interesting. Like in the 1940s, the debates around it are still kind of operating with a level of sophistication that's useful. Ahmad Saad keeps bouncing back and forth. Is it semi-feudal? Is it, which I mean, semi-feudal was already a term in the Soviet Union that they were using. Because Stalin didn't like Asiatic mode of production, right? And so
Yeah.
semi-feudal had
Yeah.
emerged as a term of choice. So you see that concept in the writing of Egyptian Marxists in the 40s. And they're really trying to grapple with,
Yeah.
how do you characterize rural Egypt in terms of its
Yeah.
and social
And the
relations?
easiest solution is just to add semi in front of it.
Right, exactly, exactly. And then by the 50s, it becomes kind of a slogan that people use. Feudalism, it's not a deeply theorized concept in the Nasserist tradition. It's more of a kind of slogan that intellectuals and activists had to use to demonstrate a kind of fidelity to the regime and political alignment with
Yeah.
its objectives. But the first major treatment I've come across that rejects the category altogether for Egypt is this book by Ibrahim Amir.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And I was thinking another sort of historiography that, well, it's not exactly a historiography, but a debate that your book could relate to is Martinez Alier's critique of Warrener, which is precisely about the issue of how we characterize large landowners.
Yeah.
Right. And centrally managed, that is directly managed estates, not kind of estates which are broken up and then parts of the estate are leased out to tenants and so on, but directly managed estates. So
Absolutely.
in the context of say the latifundia in Latin America and so on, the critique that Martinez Alier develops of Warrener's understanding of this whole issue. In other words, we're dealing with a class of parasites, we're dealing with a feudal class, etc., all of that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because his own kind of field work and so on was in Spain, in southern Spain, where you have these massive estates, olive growing estates, right? And basically, it's about what kind of rationality are we talking about? Economic rationality are we talking about when we deal with the ESBA owners? Okay.
Yeah.
Simply the fact that they're estate owners doesn't make them feudal. The fact that their estates are large doesn't make them feudal.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
we have to address the issue of economic rationality, and I think that's implicit in your argument.
It's implicit in the argument. I could have made it more
I'm really
explicit.
sorry.
Yeah,
I'm really sorry to be horrible, guys, but
we carry on
need
through
this.
email, right? Okay.
Yeah, we'll carry on. I have thoughts on that, so we can carry on through.
And I really look forward to that scan. Okay.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah, I'll send it to you. I'll send it to you. Definitely.
Thank you, Zain.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zain. Sorry
Thanks,
to keep
guys.
you
Thanks,
longer,
Ahmed.
Zain.
No, not at all. Thanks so much, guys. Thank you. Okay.
Bye.
Okay, see. Bye.